Jack.
Levi.
The Book Club from Hell.
Hello everyone, this is Jack with the Book Club from Hell, the world's most respected and commented upon literary salon. This episode is on one of the most mainstream books we've covered for this podcast, and also one of the most disturbing. Vladimir Nabokov, a Russian-American novelist, poet, entomologist and expert deviser of chess problems, spent 5 years of his life writing Lolita, a book about a middle-aged man having sex with a 12-year-old girl. Yes, that summary is extremely reductive, but this is how most people know of Lolita. Controversy aside, Lolita is one of the most brilliantly written novels in the English language, at least in my opinion, and one that is well worth reading. If you like what we're doing with this podcast and want to support us, we have a Patreon account, the link to which is in the show notes. We release bonus episodes on Patreon, you can hear upcoming episodes early, and we have weekly chats with subscribers about our most recent episodes. I've also published a novel called Tower, the first few chapters of which are available for free on my Substack, the link to which is in the show notes. Finally, we have a Discord server for this podcast, on which you can find Levi, me, and plenty of other degenerates who listen to the Book Club from Hell, the link to which is once again in the show notes. So, if you're ready to learn what a nymphet is, then listen on. Enjoy.
Thank you, Nabokov, for introducing me to the world of paraphilia.
That was his intention in writing Lolita. Yeah, Lolita is... It really is... So it's a controversial book, unsurprisingly, given that it is a book from the perspective of a pedophile who continuously has sex with a 12-year-old girl. Well, she gets older during the book, and that is a source of anguish for Humbert, the protagonist, that Lolita will no longer be a nymphet if she continues to grow older.
Yeah, once she gets to like 14, she's a hag. She's an old hag.
Used up.
Yeah.
And so it has attracted a great deal of controversy. And interestingly, it tends to be people who haven't read it seem to think that it's just an instruction manual, like a graphic instruction manual on how to be a pedophile and a pervert. Those who have read it acknowledge it, and I think this really is the case, that it's beautifully written. It's a stunning piece of literature. And also one of the most uncomfortable things I've ever read, because the character, it's very beautifully written. The prose is beautiful. The characterization is very, very impressive, to the point where particularly Humbert, the person narrating the book, feels like he continues to exist off the page. When you close the book, Humbert still exists. That's how vividly he is characterized by Nabokov. And you're inhabiting this man's mind to an extent, and we can get into that later when we're talking about the style as well, because during the book it feels like he's trying to seduce you, the reader, which makes it even more uncomfortable. But for many reasons, this book is deeply, deeply uncomfortable to read, yet at the same time extremely beautiful. It's an odd one. It really is a book about having sex with a 12-year-old girl, which is also an extremely beautiful novel.
He's pulled off quite an elegant literary masterpiece that is a bit the content of so aesthetically an incredible book, but then I guess it's challenging. That's what I'd say. It's a challenging book. Yeah, because I didn't find H.H. Humbert the protagonist and the what would you say, the narrator of the story. I didn't find him empathetic. Like I really disliked him, but there were also moments where, but he was a compelling character.
Yeah, extremely compelling.
And he was very rich, and obviously, so for people, the majority of the book is told from his point of view, and with his interior monologue and that sort of stuff, except for the beginning, which is I don't know how much.
Yeah, that's right,
Jack. There's a brief fake. It's so you immediately start the book, and the first person to speak is somebody introducing the diaries of Humbert Humbert, and it's like, we're releasing this after his death, and it's like an editor's note, but the editor is not a real editor. It's another character, but there's essentially the vast majority, like 95% of the book, is from Humbert Humbert's perspective, and his interiority is at the same time vile and beautiful. It's a real conflict, because it sounds beautiful, and then he directs his lust.
He's describing in beautiful terms, like watching a primary school playground from his window, looking for nymphets. He also there's also a time when he describes what precisely he means by nymphet, and how a nymphet or a fawnlet, how they're different from other like 11-year-old girls. We can introduce listeners to
that would be an interesting point to talk about, but
the specifics of what a nymphet is. Let's first talk about our expectations going into the background
and stuff. Yeah, the expectations. Yeah. Before we get too much into the content, but before we jump into may I just say my expectations? My expectations going in were I was conflicted in several ways, because I knew it was about it's a notorious book, and if you just look it up online, it was about a guy has a relationship with a 12-year-old girl, and I guess in the story he must have been about 40 or something.
He says he's middle-aged. I don't think he specifies his age, but
he doesn't specify, but something about around that age, late 30s, maybe early 40s, which is it's an uncomfortable premise for a book, and but I also know it's been so Stanley. There's 2 films on it, one of which was a Kubrick film, I believe. So it is a piece of literature, and it's famous, and it's a Penguin classic or something, or the Penguin Essentials. So it's also really well respected. Also, my partner, who's a woman, I guess it's
just because I've known you for so long, you stipulating that your partner's a woman is funny, but yes, if someone didn't know you, that's very
just so you know, so the listener knows, if you haven't heard from me before, that my partner's a woman who hasn't read it recently, but read it when she was, say, 14 or 15. And at the time, really liked the book and thought it was sexually empowering for Lolita, not the protagonist, but the protagonist's love interest, this 12-year-old girl. And I was like, wow, that's really interesting. But then my partner said something to the effect of, but now that I'm older and I think about it, I actually find it really gross. And my perspective on it has changed. And she might even read it again as an adult and compare her reading of her interpretation and experience of the book of being a teenager when she read it versus reading it as an adult. Especially over the last, say, 10 years in Australia, there's been a lot of controversy in private schools in particular coming out like with apologies. Even my school came out with a formal apology, and it's built like a garden in like our in a section of the school, apologizing for instances of child sexual abuse and the school's covering up of that child sexual abuse over the history of the school. And there was at least one case of one of the teachers at my school being convicted of child sexual crimes whilst I was a student at the school. So it's interesting. It would be interesting to hear if my partner does reread the book, comparing that experience as an adult versus reading it as a child or reading it as a teenage girl. So I was going in morbidly curious in a strange way, because I wanted to see why it was such a beautiful book, but also kind of being uncomfortable with being quite uncomfortable with the premise of the story. Yeah. Anyways, that was my expectations going in.
I think my expectations were quite similar to yours because I'd heard quite a few times from a number of people who consider Nabokov to be one of the greatest prose stylists in the English language. And I also knew that Lolita was a book about a middle-aged man having sex with a preteen. So I was interested to know what his writing style was like. I was hesitant to read it's not a super long novel, but a long enough novel about hebephilia that I wasn't sure if getting through it would be a real slug, if it would be extremely uncomfortable, extremely unsettling. I was also interested just because of the amount of controversy it's attracted over the years. It was like you said, morbid interest to see if it's as bad as people say, and also square in my mind the fact that a number of people will say that it's a sick book, it's disgusting, but it's also sold at large commercial bookshops.
It sold tens of millions of copies.
Yeah. So,
and it sold. Yeah, I walked down to one of the main bookshops in Hobart, in the middle of town, and they had 2 copies on the shelf. So it's one of the most mainstream books we've read on the show.
Yeah. So there are a combination of factors that made me interested to read it, but also hesitant. And it turns the book actually happens to live up to almost all of the things said about it, at least by people who've read it, in that it really is a book that it's squarely about the relationship between a middle-aged man and a 12, 13, I think she's
14 at the end.
14, yeah.
Or 15.
While
no,
she's
not. Yeah,
while she's with Humbert,
at the end
there is
she's like 17.
Yeah. I don't want to give away too much of the plot because I think people should read it. And I don't want to give away
his interactions with her. Plot, she's 12 to 14.
Yeah. So it's about that. Yes, it's also stunningly written. Just astonishingly good prose. And remarkable characterization. And yeah, both those things are correct at the same time. And it's a worthwhile book. We will later in the episode, I think we'll probably discuss pornography and art. I don't consider this book pornographic, and I think the people who dismiss it as such have it wrong. But it's still such an unsettling topic to tackle. And Nabokov spent 5 years of his life writing this. I'm not sure if he was looking for a challenge or what, but
he definitely gave himself one.
Yeah, picked a really tough topic to write a novel about. Nabokov was a pretty interesting guy as well. He was born in 1899 in St. Petersburg, in Imperial Russia. And his parents were Russian liberals and quite wealthy. I don't know if they were aristocrats or not. I know they owned various properties and had quite a lot of money, but I'm not sure if they were titled or not. And the family left Russia in 1919. So they fled to Crimea after the October Revolution and then went west in 1919. He went to Cambridge, studied zoology, Slavic and Romance languages, and then moved to Berlin in 1922. And his family had moved to Berlin, and they were all part of the Russian expatriate community there. And it was in Berlin that he started to become renowned as a Russian language writer. So this guy wrote in 3 languages, or wrote novels in 3 languages, in Russian, English, and French. He was raised trilingual, I think. But it's still a remarkable achievement to write novels in several languages. And of Lolita, he did lament that his prose in English didn't come to him as naturally as it did in Russian. It's a good humble brag. Could have been a Redditor. He married in 1925 and had 1 child in 1934. 1937, he and his wife moved to France. 1940, they fled France for fairly obvious reasons and moved to the United States of America. He was probably pretty sick of revolutions and invasions, having gone through the Russian Revolution and then had fled France before the advancing German army. He became a US citizen in 1945, and in the US he became well known as an English language author rather than a Russian language author. I think he taught Russian literature at Cornell. He taught at a number of universities, continued to write. Guy had a really interesting life. But he, more than anything, was known for writing the funny pedophile book called Lolita, which was, he finished it in 1953, spent 2 years trying to get it published. In the end, it was published in 1955 in France by, I think, Olympia, who Nabokov was warned by several people he knew not to publish with Olympia because most of their catalogue was porn, apparently. And they didn't spend all that much time proofreading or making sure the copies looked nice. And so the first edition of Lolita was apparently full of spelling errors, that the formatting was kind of fucked up. Nonetheless, some people reviewed it really well and said it was a fantastic novel. Other reviewers said it was smut, filth, pornography. It was banned, not too much later in France. There were I'm not sure if it got banned in the UK and the US. In part, Nabokov chose to publish in France because he was worried that it would just get banned in the UK and the US. But you can read it now. Now that we live in an enlightened time of progress, you can read Lolita by Nabokov. And also now that, if it gets banned in physical editions, Z Library exists, LibGen exists.
Yeah.
You can now access Lolita more easily than you could access it at any other point in history.
And what would you say that Nabokov's problem situation was? So he wrote an essay at the end of one of that's appended to the end of, I think, probably most modern editions.
Yeah, the edition I have had this essay at the end of it on a book entitled Lolita.
And Jack read it and I didn't. So I'll let Jack explain the problem situation.
The problem situation... So we were talking about this before recording, and Levi got it right, where you said you feel like his problem situation was basically aesthetic. Because this book doesn't feel like it's a pro-pedophilic work by any stretch, especially the ending.
I wouldn't have thought so.
No.
But it's also not necessarily anti-pedophilic.
But it's not... I would say it doesn't moralize.
Yeah, it doesn't moralize. It's just, this is a story that happened.
He trusts the reader enough to pick through a complex situation and come away with complex feelings about it.
Trust or
or just disregard.
Disregard. It feels more like disregard. He is just... This is a story that, for whatever reason, captured his attention and needed to be told, and it required his highest attention to his craft, and he created something aesthetically beautiful. And it's like, yeah, this is it. Take it or leave it. Do what you want with it.
Yeah, so I've got a few quotes from Nabokov himself explaining the problem situation, which it's just aesthetic. So I quote, "Teachers of literature are apt to think up such problems as, what is the author's purpose? Or still worse, what is the guy trying to say? Now, I happen to be the kind of author who, in starting to work on a book, has no other purpose than to get rid of that book, and who, when asked to explain its origin and growth, has to rely on such ancient terms as interreaction of inspiration and combination, which, I admit, sounds like a conjurer explaining one trick by performing another." And he said that the basic outline of a story of a young girl being pursued by an older man who... I won't get into the plot details, but much of the basic outline of Lolita, or at least the first half, was present from the start. And it was with him for a number of years, and he kept approaching this skeleton of a story and then withdrawing, then approaching it, then withdrawing. And then eventually, when he was living in the United States, he committed and for 5 years got this book out of his system. Here we go. This is another interesting clue as to what problem he was trying to solve. I quote, "There are gentle souls who would pronounce Lolita meaningless because it does not teach them anything. I am neither a reader nor a writer of didactic fiction, and, despite John Ray's assertion, Lolita has no moral in tow. For me, a work of fiction exists only insofar as it affords me what I shall bluntly call aesthetic bliss, that is, a sense of being somehow, somewhere connected with other states of being where art, curiosity, tenderness, kindness, ecstasy is the norm. There are not many such books." Now, that's really interesting, and I expect that's actually the problem, if you want to call it that he was trying to solve. He has this book in his head. He wants to produce something which is aesthetically beautiful, and he really seems quite contemptuous of people who write books that symbolize things, who look for symbolism in books, and as such wasn't interested in writing that sort of book. He's not interested in moralizing to you, in offering any sort of clear lesson. I suppose a reader could read it and draw some sort of lessons from it, but these are not going to be lessons given by the author. The author is offering a situation that a reader responds to.
Yeah. Which is oddly respectable.
It's a high-stakes game when you write a novel about something that he would have known would stir controversy. He
tried to publish it pseudonymously.
Yeah.
That tells you.
The French
exactly
publisher wouldn't let him. Yeah, he initially did want to publish under a pseudonym. Because again, it's even people today will ask, was this guy a pedophile? When I said to my wife that we're doing Lolita for an episode and she was asking about Nabokov, her first question was, well, did he fuck kids?
Maybe.
It's like, look,
not as far as I'm aware.
Not as far as I know.
He was never convicted of anything like that.
I don't think he was accused of anything either. I think he...
No.
I mean, I'm inclined to take his word for it. He just had this story in his head and eventually committed to writing it down. I'm glad he did. I think it's a wonderful book. It's just Can
I ask you a question?
Yeah.
I don't know if this is a good place to start, just go straight into a jumping off point, but I'll ask it now, given that you've brought up the point. I would call this creative compulsion. He had this, it's like this mind worm. Came out with this mind worm. And how many thoughts do you have a day? 1,000 thoughts or more or something? And so one day he had one of those.
Just kept bugging him.
It just kept there and it wouldn't let him go for how many years it simmered away until he just sat down, completed the book, made it up to his standard for what he wanted in terms of the beauty of the prose and so forth. Got the story out of himself, and then went on to his, because he published another few books after that.
He published a lot of books. This guy was prolific. I think he published 8 books in Russian before he even started writing English books.
and Lolita, I think, was about halfway through his career, so he still had heaps in him. So I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts on this creative compulsion? Do you relate to it at all? And what's your experience been like with having a mind worm of an idea?
I think it exists, and I've heard a number of authors talk about something similar or refer to what's probably the same phenomenon in slightly different ways. Yeah, you can get an idea that's fascinating and start to pick at it, and sometimes it's only a short story or not even that.
Yeah.
Sometimes you keep picking at it and then it just expands in front of you. And you realise
you've sucked into it.
Yeah, you've stumbled onto something really, really interesting. And then there's an acceleration phase where the more you explore, the more complexity is revealed and the more you want to pursue it. And if you pursue it enough, then that idea comes alive and starts generating itself. Like you start dreaming about it and it starts revealing things to you without you searching for them. And yeah, eventually you just have to follow it to the end and to exhaust it for it to be gone.
Otherwise it won't leave you alone.
Yeah, fortunately, all the times that has happened to me, it's never been about a middle-aged man having a pedophilic relationship. No. So I've never been bothered.
Is that what
anything
your experience was like with Tower? Because I know you started picking at that idea first came to you when you were still in Australia, like quite a while ago. Like 2018 or something, right? Like,
2018.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's probably... I imagine it's similar for basically any creative project, is you come across an idea that so strongly suggests connections with other ideas that it starts to follow them seemingly of its own accord.
And were you pursuing that with regards to only aesthetics, or were there was multiple... with Tower, for example, it was aesthetics and something else, or was it purely aesthetics? Like, where would you...
I think it depends on how...
The foci.
It's probably a semantic question. So I find certain ideas really, really beautiful and like exploring them. And it depends on whether someone would consider that to be aesthetic or not.
So what do you think of what he was talking about, aesthetic bliss? Like he just wants to be in worlds of aesthetic bliss.
I don't feel it as strongly as him. So say Dostoevsky is just totally different in his approach to writing literature to Nabokov, in that in, say, The Brothers Karamazov, the entire book is structured such that Dmitri's trial can be interpreted as a trial in a temporal court over temporal questions of murder. At the same time, it is mirrored as a description of how humans relate to the divine and to Jesus Christ and to God. And one of the amazing things about the Brothers Karamazov is it's doing these two things at exactly the same time, but the same structure is doing two things at once. And so Dostoevsky was not writing for aesthetic bliss, or not with the same single-mindedness as Nabokov. He's very didactic. He's trying to convince you to become a Christian. That's what he's there for. That was one of his major goals. So with that preface, I don't feel this drive just for aesthetics in the same way as Nabokov. He seemed very single-minded.
Yeah.
I would grant that there's a broader range of motivations behind why you would write things and why you would write worthwhile things than Nabokov seemed to, because he seemed extremely dismissive of people who would write things that are didactic and symbolic. Like, again, The Brothers Karamazov is both of those things in spades. Yet I would consider it to be a wonderful book. But yeah, I think there's always an element of it. So if there were absolutely no element of aesthetics in writing novels, you just write dot points, like a plot plan, and publish that and say, well, there you go. The fact that it's rendered in prose demonstrates at least some care for aesthetics.
Yeah.
There's a very long way of saying it depends on the person. I don't think Nabokov was generous enough to acknowledge that other people might write for different reasons. That said, he's so good at the pure aesthetics of writing that he can kind of say whatever he wants. I mean, it doesn't matter. He's so good he can get away with it.
Lolita.
Oh, how this book starts, how it starts, from the first sentence, you're like, all right, I get where this is going.
I guess
Should we talk about the style and things like that? Like this book from an aesthetic perspective?
Yeah, I was kind of going to go in that direction. Maybe my question would be, we can start off here or see where it goes. It seems to me like Nabokov has turned an ugly concept into a beautiful piece of... Is there some visual... like Hieronymus Bosch or something.
Yeah.
This kind of grotesque beauty to it. It's the literary equivalent of something like that, where you see this horrific thing doing rendered, this horrific event or sequence of events rendered rendered by an incredible craftsperson. In a beautiful form. And it makes it all the more horrific. One of the things that I've just written down is the book's style is incredibly engaging. He's just a phenomenal writer.
It's stunning. This guy he's up there with people like Joyce in terms of just the being a sheer virtuoso and how he uses language. But so with Joyce's works have always left me quite cold in that I can really appreciate the linguistic acrobatics, but what is actually being described, it's like in Ulysses, like it's kind of funny describing, I think it's Leopold Bloom taking a piss. He's like described in like this intensely overdone scientific language. It's very, very funny and kind of cool what he's doing, but past a point, it's like I've just spent 20 pages reading about a guy taking a piss. Whereas in this book, there are really interesting characters interacting in really interesting ways and developing in really interesting ways, and they're so vivid and so intensely human that they feel real.
But that makes it worse.
And it's not only that. It's not only that makes it worse, but
because you're reading, I want to keep on reading. This is horrible. I feel like throwing up.
Well, it's even worse because this book is this is a book in part about seduction, but the style itself is seductive because what is being described is it's vile because he doesn't shy away from it. So he doesn't depict sex between Humbert Humbert and Lolita, although it's very indirect. He'll say they've had sex. Although I don't think he ever uses the word sex. Or he will describe a sexual act in very, very indirect terms. So it's not pornographic in that sense. But it's still like this is still a book about a pedophilic relationship. But what the style does is it seduces the reader. It draws the reader in. And so even though you're revolted by a lot of the content.
Deeply
you keep going. You want to keep more. Coming back. It's part of what is so unsettling about the book and so uncomfortable is that
tortuous.
You in some way feel complicit because you keep coming back to see what Humbert Humbert is doing, what he's thinking.
Yeah, it implicates you as the reader. The aesthetic hook of it, the aesthetic engagement of it, almost implicates you as a literary criminal in Nabokov and Humbert Humbert's crime against a fictional Lolita.
And the style is it's remarkable because also he doesn't just have one trick. So some people who write really well will have a trick they lean on. So sometimes this book is written the framing device, like you said earlier, is Humbert Humbert is in prison. He says that, I think it's over the course of 56 days, he's written what you, the reader, are reading as Lolita. He then says, I don't want this published until I have died and when Lolita has died. So none of us have to deal with the fallout of this book. And so there are a bunch of different things I want to talk about. The various ways in which the style of this book is remarkable. So he doesn't rely on one trick. So there'll be there's lots of wordplay. There's, at its most basic, say, lots of alliteration or things rhyming, or there'll be anagrams, or there'll be funny plays on common phrases. And these are basically constant throughout the entire book. It's just a treasure trove of these just little linguistic flights of fancy. Then there'll be moments of, like how the book starts with the Lolita, of him just like repeating sounds in Lolita's name. This almost childish focus on phonemes or the particular way that a word moves in your mouth. And then, of course, there's use of metaphor in really, really surprising ways. He also does really interesting things where he'll convey Humbert Humbert's various mental states very elegantly and without really drawing a huge amount of attention to it. And it's done in such a way that it just feels totally natural. It doesn't feel shoehorned in at all. There's this one section, probably a third of the way through the book or so, when Humbert has Lolita with him and they're in a hotel. And Humbert is walking around the hotel and he thinks that everyone at the hotel is aware that he has Lolita in his room. And people keep talking to him and he keeps mishearing it as people accusing him of having a 12-year-old girl in his room. And then someone will repeat themselves and they'll be saying something completely innocuous that rhymes with what he misheard. It's remarkable how he just slides between these various things. Here's a scene where the character is obviously misinterpreting what's going on around him, but it doesn't feel as blocked off from the rest of the text as it would with almost any other author. It's just so elegant, so gradual how it eases in, so natural. It's truly remarkable how he writes.
And an important point about the character, and it gets set up pretty early, is that he, before interacting and meeting Lolita, Humbert has at least one, if not multiple, stays in an institutional, like a mental asylum. And so there is also this question of his mental stability, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, also he acknowledges that while he was in prison, I think he was... So in the writing of Lolita, he says that first he was in a psychiatric part of a prison and now he's just in the prison during the 56 days over which he wrote Lolita. So he continuously alludes to the fact that he might be mentally unstable. Let's talk about Humbert, actually, as a character. And while talking about him, we can talk about the prose style too. Because so Humbert is he was born in Paris. He has, I think his family are Swiss, or at least some of his family members are Swiss. And he's described as this dapper Central European gentleman by himself, and this is important. Yeah, so he is
handsome.
Yeah, so the unreliable narrator trope is overdone, but in this book, it is basically like everything in this book. It is done remarkably well. So Humbert says that he's tall, handsome, brooding, charming, the consummate Central European gentleman. You don't know if this is the case. He's convinced that every adult woman he comes across just falls in love with him.
He's
on at least one occasion he is right.
And he could have
he's
any
correct.
woman he wants. Yeah.
But yeah, he also it's so well characterized that he will tell the reader, I am incredibly handsome. I have a beautiful voice. I'm irresistible to women. I'm only saying this so you understand the context within which all of these things are happening. Otherwise, I wouldn't say it because I'm bashful and I'm humble. But to contextualize it for the reader, I have to tell you, it's so... He's constantly telling you this, and the book as a whole is in large part him trying to justify his relationship with Lolita and his behavior towards her. And so as the reader, you constantly feel him trying to woo you by showing off his his knowledge of French. So he's constantly making interjections in French. With his plays on words, with his jokes, with him telling you about how smart he is or how handsome he is or how tall he is or how learned he is. He's constantly trying to charm you, and at times he is very charming. And this is part of the process of making the reader feel complicit, is at times you do feel charmed by him when he says something really funny. And then he'll mention what he's doing, like how he's just driving around America with a 12-year-old that he doesn't have legal custody of, whom he's taken out of school so he can keep having sex with her. It's very uncomfortable too, because it really feels like he's going out of his way to make you like him. And again, the characterization of Humbert is such that it doesn't feel like it is Nabokov doing this. It feels like it's Humbert trying to seduce you.
Yeah, and he as a character is... How would I put it? If some of the scenes and the way that he describes his love for, or not love, lust, infatuation with this 12-year-old is, if it were in the context of, say, like a Romeo and Juliet or something, two young lovers of the same age roughly or whatever, you think, wow, that's young love for you. That's two people being obsessed with one another. And then it's just, but then this is a 40-year-old dude saying this about a 12-year-old. So it's the perversion of poetic love by the taboo, I suppose, and that kind of it sort of, well, for me at least, it poisoned like all of those scenes in this really strange way for me as a reader. I found both thinking that's a beautiful thing to think of another person, except it's a 12-year-old, or it'll be the way that he said it. You might say, when you're infatuated with somebody, you'll pay particular attention to different parts of who they are and their body. And so you might say, pay particular attention to their ankles or something, and how, I don't know, their calves become slender down to their, whatever, ankles, yada, yada, beautiful words. Except because he's describing a 12-year-old, he'll do the description and then add some little thing some description about the infantile.
Yeah, he'll say like, the downy fur on her lip.
Yeah, so it's a beautiful description, but then it's this mixture of he's not shying away from the infantile parts of that description. He's mixing the infantile parts with sexualization and with the aesthetics of the way that he's saying it itself. So he's using that mixture of infantile sexualization to like poison the beautiful aesthetics. It's like a poison dart or something into the entire book. It's really, it's definitely, I've not read something like it.
Yeah, you're right. He reels you in with more conventional or just less emotionally loaded descriptions of love, and then slaps you in the face with something that reminds you. It's like, oh yeah, he's describing a child.
Yeah,
and he absolutely doesn't shy away from the pedophile aspect. No. Like it is front and center. Humbert is a pedophile, and he has been for his whole life,
and he's aware.
He tries to analyze himself, so there is
moral implications.
He did have a love. He was in love with a girl of his own age, or a very similar age,
when he was 12.
And talks about how the two of them almost had sex, but were interrupted and weren't able to. And so he wonders whether his pedophilia later in life is a result of this or not. But it's also funny that he'll be throwing out these things, and it could be that he's just trying to convince the reader that he's sympathetic. Because while he's throwing out these possible explanations for his pedophilia, in the end, he just accepts that, well, this is how it is. I just like nymphets. And I guess we can talk about nymphets and fawnlets. Because when I say he doesn't shy away from the pedophilia aspect, he rubs your face in it. Especially when he talks about...
He's got a typology of young women.
He calls them nymphets and occasionally fawnlets, but mostly nymphets. And these are the types of girls he really likes. And he says, okay, so they're girls of, I think he said it was like 10 or 11 to 14 or 15.
Yep.
They can't look too womanly because his descriptions of adult women are really funny. Like he calls them big, thick, animal. And as opposed to him describing children where they're slender, thin, angelic, lithe. He says, though, that what really defines a nymphet is something ineffable. It's a way they carry themselves where he says they are consciously or unconsciously aware of their sexual power and are flaunting it. And he can pick nymphets immediately, and he loves nymphets. And like there are parts of the story where he'll be talking about driving down the road and says, and I saw a nymphet walking down the street in shorts along the sidewalk. Ugh. It's like it really is like this is a book written from the perspective of a pedophile.
Yeah, because so he describes you could have even say a 12-year-old girl who he might consider attractive but not a nymphet.
Not a nymphet.
There's something about the blossoming of her sexuality or something like that and he can pick up, or he claims to be, and this is because it's all from his perspective. You never get Lolita's perspective on anything. You never get the perspective of any of these young women that he's perving on when he goes to a park.
Like, I don't want to give too much away. At the end of the book, again, it's hard to tell if he's not trying to manipulate you with this, but it seems like Lolita's perspective breaks through to him. But again, maybe he's just trying to manipulate you.
Yeah, which is hard to tell. So it's how do you say it's his interpretation of a young girl that he sees on the street or whatever. It's not, there's no consideration about maybe this girl is just being a person and doesn't have any conception of being a nymphette or any intention or unconscious or whatever. And it's just a complete sexualization of what I found disturbing about him as a character is it's like he didn't see people as individual people. He sees them as especially obviously young women, or that he finds sexually attractive. He doesn't consider them. It's the way that he talks about them is very dehumanizing.
Yeah, extremely. And interestingly too, how he talks about adult women is
also
Humbert really resents adult women. He does not like them.
So it's an extreme form of and particular type of misogyny and chauvinism that is twisted into this extreme fetishization of young women, or a certain type of young woman, and disgust towards just a woman. And I don't know. Okay, so you know what's interesting about it in reflecting on it? Let's say hypothetically, just not to... I think engaging with a book like this, if you're going to read a book like this, to get the most out of the experience, if you're going to subject yourself to reading about a 40-year-old man having a relationship with a 12-year-old, if you're going to subject yourself to that, you should I tried to personally clock when I felt disgusted or whatever. and just be like, okay, that's what Nabokov is like. That's part of this experience is to just feel that mixture of aesthetic appreciation, getting punched and then getting punched in the gut, you know, and not just to throw it out, because I think sometimes people really, as soon as they feel disgusted by something, they just won't even engage with it. And so you've almost got to be, in order to engage with this, or even something like Bataille, or 100 Days of Sodom, or whatever, 120 Days of Sodom, you need to, if you want to get the most out of it, have a degree of impartiality towards your own emotions in order to engage and finish the text. And just and in this particular instance, for me, if you do that, you maybe think, okay, there is child sexual assault, and not just like one-off instances of it, but like on, grooming relationships,
continuous.
And so, over the course of years potentially. And in some instances, it's very clear that it was completely coercive in a very this person just like forced their body on the other person. But in some instances, that's why we have this idea of grooming, right? And in the instances where there's grooming, the person who did the grooming, like the adult or the older person, they must have convinced themselves somehow, and they must have been so infatuated with that younger person to commit that thing. And then the question is, well, what is their experience like? And if you were going to look for a literary representation of the inside of one of those people's subjective experience during a grooming relationship, Nabokov has captured it in beautiful form. And it's, I guess most people probably don't want to go there in their exploration of other people's subjectivity, except I couldn't help but think, wow, I could imagine somebody having this experience. It seems compellingly realistic in a weird way, how many times has something, a good example, just to use to try to get across what I mean, is when what's the book that the stabby book,
We've read a number of books by people.
Hitchcock.
Oh,
Hitchcock.
Psycho.
Yeah, Psycho.
Like
so the book that's based on. So the book that is based on, when that was published, maybe 6 months later or something, it turned out that there was in fact some guy who was chopping up women and creating masks and stuff out of their skin. And the author of the book didn't know about this. They happened almost concurrently.
Oh, was that Ed Gein?
Yeah. That's right. The story of Ed Gein.
Yeah.
And the author
would
of the book
exhume bodies and make bowls out of skulls.
And he killed 2 or 3 living women, and he was trying to recreate his now dead mother and to be able to look like his mother by stitching together. That was a real story, and the original Psycho book also. So there was this weird coincidence of a fiction writer writing something that they didn't intend to correspond to somebody's actual life, but it in fact did, to
went too deep,
eerie degree. And what I'm saying is that this has that feeling. It has that same feeling to it for me. It's that I could imagine that there's people out there who have engaged in grooming behavior and have had basically the same thoughts as Humbert in their situation.
Because it's also when Humbert describes his burgeoning pedophilia, it feels plausible when he'll say, he said, in Paris, I'd go to visit prostitutes and ask for really young looking ones to try to get this feeling out of my body, but I was always disgusted by fully grown women. And how he described it as this constant assault or feeling of pressure, and that sex basically with adults would partially alleviate it but would never sate this hunger. But again, just in the background of everything you read in this book, You have the feeling of Humbert Humbert trying to seduce you, the reader, trying to convince you that he's in the right, or to make himself appear sympathetic. Because he, at a few points in the book, he says, my lawyer has said that I should tell the jury this. And the book is, at times, it feels like he's addressing a jury or coming up with things to tell a jury.
Well, sometimes he literally says it. He says, you the juror, or something like that. He does.
But then by the end of the book, he says, you know what, I want this published once I'm dead, once Lolita is dead. And it's just part of the complexity of Humbert Humbert that, even though at the end of the book there does seem to be, I don't want to spoil anything, but at the end of the book, there seems to be this moment when he realizes, or at least gets an inkling of what Lolita might have felt during all this. And he says, and this is after she's older, and he's not as physically infatuated with her anymore because she's not a nymphet anymore, but he still, in some sense, loves her. And that's part of the real discomfort with this book too, is the line between just physical infatuation and obsession and genuine love for a child as a middle-aged man is very, very blurry. But anyways, at the end of the book, he seems to get some understanding of her as a human being who is separate from his own desires. And then says, on the basis of this, I don't want this published while she's still alive so she can have something of a normal life. But again, is he just trying to make you, the reader, see him as the good guy in the situation? He's a really complex character. Like I said, he feels like a real person. He feels that complex.
Which again, it kind of makes it worse.
And you're just locked in this guy's perspective as well.
Yeah. And
it makes it way worse. Because he's not a cartoon villain. He's not like a cartoon evil pedophile. It's more unsettling because he feels like a person who's trying to reel you in and make you like him, and he has some appealing characteristics in that at times he's very funny. This book can be very, very funny. There's one section where he's talking to the headmistress of the Beardsley School for Girls, and I think there are two scenes with this woman, and both of them are just so funny. She's constantly getting Humbert Humbert's name wrong. She's psychoanalyzing the girls, and is demonstrating this very, very self-conscious modernity. It's so funny. And then Humbert Humbert's descriptions of this interaction are fantastic. I guess the fact that you, or at least I won't speak for you, naturally describe this book as things that Humbert Humbert says rather than Vladimir Nabokov saying demonstrates how well characterized Humbert Humbert is.
I like that Nabokov was able to make it feel as though it really was written by somebody else.
Yeah.
And it's not Nabokov. Yeah. As in, if you gave this to a person and removed the name of the author and just said this is the diary that's been published by somebody who's been convicted of these crimes, and they didn't know, like just hypothetically, they'd never heard of Lolita, you could see them accepting it as, oh, that's crazy. And if
I guess the one thing speaking against that would be how well written it is.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
That would be the one thing in reading it, to be like, oh,
that's really well done.
Is this some nobody? Like, why is this nobody writing at this level of prose?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, true. So other than the style, for sure. So we've read obviously a lot of books that have made us uncomfortable for different reasons, but in a strange way, this might take the cake for me. Yeah. Because he's done such a fucking good job. You know, you can even look at the story of the Eye, and because there's just this level of gratuitous, I don't know, gore or whatever, it sort of takes you out of it because, I mean, I know crazy stuff does happen. You know, even we'll say like 120 Days of Sodom or something, or any of J.G. Ballard's stuff. I don't know. I guess sometimes gore or over the top gore, or if it's a situation that really could only happen in fiction. I don't know. I can't think. But it's so absurd that, I don't know, running away with a priest or something on a boat to Africa or something. It sort of allows you to break, maintain. Yeah, I'd say intentionally suspend your disbelief to accommodate the fictional world. Whereas with this book, that is not the case. Everything he describes sounds legitimately like this could have just happened. This could have just happened. There's no instance, other than the beauty of the prose itself, there's no instance where it's like, oh, well, this sounds just, no, this is complete fantasy. It's actually, this could have happened, and that almost makes it worse. Again, that's the theme for me today. He's done such a good job at executing this concept that it's made the core idea so much.
He's just executed too well. It's interesting comparing it to Bataille, because Bataille was very, very influenced by surrealism. And something like The Story of the Eye, to me, it feels surreal and dreamlike, and it feels it's definitely based on reality, but it has enough weirdness that it feels separate.
Yeah, you can get away from it. You can separate yourself from it.
Whereas this is, it's a realist. And it's really, really well done.
Yeah. So I think we've spoken quite a bit about the aesthetic perspective and the discussion around that sort of stuff, the voice. The next topic that we thought would be interesting to explore, if you want to move on to, would be controversy.
Yeah.
Its place in art and the relationship with the author or the artist in whichever case. Do you want to kick us off on that?
Yeah, particularly. So what's the, I guess you call it, the use of controversial topics in art?
Well, would Nabokov say there was a use? I feel like Nabokov would say, like, no, that's writing with the intention to impart some effect on. I was just writing because that's what I wanted to write about. So maybe he wasn't trying to use controversy.
Yeah, he might not have been trying to use it, but nonetheless, the fact that this book is written about something that, at least for most people, makes them feel disgust.
So
does change the character of the book, because
does it change the character of the book? Yeah,
because think about, suppose Lolita were written about the relationship between a 19-year-old and Humbert.
Or a 19-year-old and a 17-year-old or something. There's this close age gap.
Or like even if Lolita remains 12, but Humbert is 14.
Yeah, it changed.
So that would actually be, so that'd be more controversial, because it's still like, it's a story about two children having sex.
Yeah.
But yet suppose Lolita and Humbert are both adults. I think that really would change. That would really change the book, because it could be as beautifully written as it is, but that quality you were describing of describing very unsettling things, making the reader to an extent complicit in these things by offering the reader a sort of an aesthetic milieu within which these things are discussed that is attractive and makes the reader want to engage with it. Plus that morbid interest of, look, here's something really fucked up that it's like looking at a car crash. Like you want to look at it. There's part of you that's fascinated. I do think the fact that this does deal with very controversial topics changes the nature of the book. It's that, it was like you were saying earlier, how he will be describing, say, features of how Lolita looks and how she makes him feel, and will use actually mostly quite conventional things or descriptions that could be applied to an adult and that keep the reader feeling comfortable, and then slaps you in the face with something that makes you realize, oh yeah, this is a child. That effect wouldn't be there were it not for the fact that this book deals with such a taboo topic.
Yeah, that's right. The taboo, or the breaking of the taboo, or the depiction of the taboo being broken is absolutely integral to the story. I don't think it would have ever had the acclaim and the notoriety and stuff if he had done it about a non-controversial relationship.
But also, I don't think it would artistically be quite as interesting if it didn't have the taboo. Because the way I think of it is,
because a lot of that is mixing the disgust and the beauty. Yeah,
because it's almost if something is very comfortable, you can engage with it while being not totally asleep, but almost taking it for granted, not being fully alert.
Yeah.
Whereas when you bring in something that just breaks a taboo, like Humbert saying how much he loves staring at the thighs of 11-year-old girls, it's like getting cold water thrown over you. You're suddenly awake. You're suddenly very, very alert because something has come up that just stimulates this very, very animal disgust response.
It's a shock of electricity.
You're there. Like you're engaged with the text.
I hate it with my sister she can't visualize. She doesn't have like a mind's eye sort of thing. She doesn't, and which I find really interesting because that's how I learn stuff. I visualize things in my head. Apparently, it's like a whole thing. I don't know. Whatever. She's managed to work around it. It's fine for her. She's fine. But I found that really interesting. I was thinking whilst I was reading that book, I was like, I hate the fact that I'm visualizing.
How would she deal with Lolita, I wonder?
I don't know how she'd deal with it. But to me, because I'm visualizing stuff in my head, Nabokov is making me visualize things that I don't want to visualize.
And he's just forcing these images into your head. And because he's so good at description, they're very vivid images.
There's this one scene where Humbert, as Jack said, is this tall Central European man. He's like sauntering around the house or whatever, and he walks slowly into the kitchen as Lolita is just in sports shorts and a white t-shirt or something, and she's leaning out the window talking to somebody on the street, and she's bent over, and he's just walking slowly towards her, just like taking everything in, and he describes himself as walking, something to the effect of walking slowly like an injured spider. And I was like, oh, that's so fucking gross. That's so gross. Like, over to this 12-year-old. And because he's does such a good job of describing this scene, and obviously because you're visualizing it yourself, unless you happen to be somebody who can't visualize things, it's like, I was just thinking, don't put that image in my head.
But that scene is a good example of why I think this particular subject matter makes the book so much more artistically potent. Because what he'll do, he'll reel you in where, like, if you're a heterosexual guy, just like, at least when I read that initial part of, like, someone bending over, looking out a window, and he's walking towards her, in my mind's eye, initially, like, it's an adult woman.
Yeah.
And so initially Nabokov has this thing in my head where I'm going like, oh yeah, that's all right. I don't have any problems with this. And then, like, once he's reeled you in enough, he reminds you it's a 12-year-old, and you go, it's disgusting.
Yeah, be like, say something about her shrill, high-pitched voice or whatever that hasn't broken out or something. You're just like, God, stop. So I guess what he, at least in the essay that he wrote and was attached to the end of my edition of this book, when he's saying that he's not writing to moralize, he's not writing didactic fiction, I don't think what he means there is that he won't use controversy or
use breaking taboos to an aesthetic end. I think what he's saying is he's not going to use breaking taboos to a moralistic end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like he's not in the section.
Yeah.
There was you bring up the spider reminded me. There's this bit where like he's not even describing anything sexual, but it's so uncomfortable where it's near the start of the book. He's talking about how he meets Lolita basically. He goes to live somewhere, to live in someone's spare room. It's a woman, Charlotte, and her daughter, Dolores, or Lolita for short. And the first time he sees Lolita, he's just in love. He says, this is the best nymph ever. No one is like her. And he's describing himself as a spider sitting in his room, and he can feel with his web where Lolita is in the house at all times. You can feel her movement.
Worst scenes
through the building.
Yeah. Spider's web throughout the room. And just this idea that this man is just paying so much attention to this 12-year-old, like really is just a predator in the house. And at all times, apparently, is just hyper aware of where she is, whether she's at home and so forth.
Yeah, but you've got the taboo breaking of this middle-aged man who's just so laser-focused on a 12-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
But he's not using this. He's not depicting this and then going to the reader, and this is really bad. This is morally repugnant. He's using it to an aesthetic end. Because as a reader, you can read it and come to your own conclusions about how ethical it is. And he doesn't seem very interested in beating you over the head with that. But he's using it to create extremely strong feelings in a reader. And for, at least in this book, I think that he's using controversy and taboo breaking to a very artistically potent end.
I would agree. Having said that, so to bring it back to the controversy discussion, perhaps the way that I would put it is the controversy is a consequence of his problem situation, which is aesthetic, but the object of his aesthetic problem is a taboo. He's trying to tell a beautiful story about a taboo relationship. And that's what he was trying to do. The controversy is that will be an inherently controversial thing to do.
Yeah.
But that's a consequence that was not necessarily a goal, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, it's almost like he's trying to get some sort of emotional response out of you. And this is one of the buttons he's pushing. Disgust at the thought of a sexual relationship between a child and a grown man. And I get it's a very high stakes game because it'd be very easy to get wrong. And there's plenty of artistic output that is just trying to be shocking. And it doesn't feel like it's doing anything more than lighting matches in your face, like just depicting something disgusting and not going beyond that. Whereas what Nabokov is doing is he's using your disgust to draw you even deeper into this aesthetic world he's creating.
It's very strange to say this about a book of this topic, but I would consider it a masterpiece.
Absolutely. This is phenomenally written.
And all the more so because he's been able to take this sort of topic and do such a he's pulled it off. He pulled off this the triple, what do you say, like some crazy trick, like a triple backflip through a ring of fire.
And there's not much room to maneuver. Like you could get this wrong pretty easily.
You get one shot at it. You probably get in your career, in your professional career as a rider, you get one shot at doing something like this. And if you mess it up, that's it. You're done.
Yeah.
But no, he wrote a bunch of books afterwards and is critically acclaimed, and so he pulled it off, which in and of itself is, I guess, just a testimony to what a phenomenal writer he is. I'm really interested in reading some of his other books now.
So on the basis of this, I got Nabokov's Dozen, which is a collection of short stories, and Pale Fire, which is
Pale Fire looks really
a novel. And I'll read them. Really looking forward to it.
So
I can't emphasize enough how good a stylist he is.
Yeah, just the way that he made Humbert, his like interactions with the world, like it's so like electric in a weird way. Like he's a character that even outside of his relationship with Lolita feels things and experiences the world very vividly, which I think is
extremely.
You know, sometimes you meet people and you can feel in the way that they communicate and hold that they have a very vivid and intense relationship with their experience of the world. And other people just seem more, I don't know, numb or docile or, you know, just whatever. And sometimes when you meet those people, it's really interesting to engage with them because you can have an interesting conversation with them. It's really cool. And in this case, Humbert is one of those people.
What about this? So Nabokov vehemently denied that you should do this, but obviously other people disagree. How much should we read into an artist's person or their morals or their background, etc., through their art, or how much can we do this?
I think that you can have... So how direct in my answer to the question should I be? I think we should give artists full license to create the art that they feel compelled to create and declare a degree of separation between them and the art. Because otherwise, I mean, so for example, there's lots of movies and books that are horror or about crime thrillers and stuff. You know, the entire Dexter series. Does anybody think for a second that the people who wrote and directed Dexter and the actor who played Dexter are themselves somehow murderers, sick murderers? No, we don't. And that's because for whatever reason in our cultural paradigm, depicting that type of story is not taboo. It's actually very huge.
We're quite comfortable with mind-bending violence.
Mind-bending violence and gratuitous like torture of people and stuff. But then when somebody breaks a taboo, like this one, all of a sudden people go, oh, is Nabokov, what did he get up to? You know? And then the contrapositive of that is that you have artists such as Polanski. Well, was Roman Polanski, he was convicted, was he? Or I can't remember. Maybe I should look up.
No, but
you know, other
he had a much more
artists.
Direct relationship with pedophilia than Nabokov did.
Yeah, so let's take the contrapositive. There are in fact other artists who did have these sorts of relationships with minors, but did not depict any of those sorts of relationships in their work. So in both directions, you can have an artist who depicts the thing and is not themselves guilty of it, and you can have artists who don't depict it, but they are guilty of it. So to me, just on pure sentential logic, the argument doesn't hold any water. That's my first intuition to go there. And the reason why I think it's important to allow an artist to create the work and then be able to step back from it and say, well, that doesn't necessarily represent my moral character or who I am or what I think about the world, is because, at least as far as I'm concerned, part of the role of the artist in the world is to expand our vision of ideas of the world itself, of beauty, and to explore these spaces. And if they can't do that exploration without worrying that they're going to get their head chopped off socially or culturally or physically, then we're going to artificially put bounds on what artists can do. It's like saying to a comedian, oh, you can't say that sort of joke. So we've just delimited like what's the frontier that the culture can actually explore. And that's kind of my high level. I'm sure that I could be a bit more nuanced, but that's my first instinct with regards to that particular conversation. And then the next follow-up question is, well, who gets to draw that boundary and enforce it? Obviously, it's not the artist.
Me.
It's somebody else. It's somebody other than, it's somebody who didn't create the art, who only wants to engage with it in a sensorial role, in a censorship role,
or a moralistic.
It's not the artists themselves in a moralistic and a censorship based role. It's not the artists themselves. Anyways, that's my first thoughts. At least, what do you reckon? What are your thoughts?
So I think you can infer some things about an artist from the art they create. Apart from anything else, you can infer that Vladimir Nabokov had this idea of a story about a pedophilic relationship.
I wouldn't say that you
head
can't infer anything
for a number of years.
Sorry,
I guess the problem is that a number of people seem to have decided that because he had this idea of a story in his head, then that maps onto his desires.
Yeah.
So because you have these ideas about Humbert's relationship with Lolita in your head, therefore you must desire this relationship that Humbert has with Lolita. And I think that's a leap that you can't really make.
No. Does Stephen King want to kill people?
Maybe.
Maybe. Probably does.
Yeah. So I think you can infer what people have been thinking about from their art.
You can infer what he spent the last 5 years
thinking about quite intensely.
In a lot of detail.
But from that, I'm not confident that you can infer someone's desires.
Let's say, hypothetically, Mr. Nabokov, during those 5 years, he had to visualize in his own mind the sexual activity and then craft his words, the sexual interactions between Humbert and Lolita. So he was imagining it.
Oh yeah,
and then he
probably a lot because it's also rendered so vividly. He didn't do it accidentally.
But then the question is, okay, but if you're an artist, is it possible? Okay, so is it possible that he could imagine those scenes in his head and render them into his words and edit them and stuff for a long period of time, but in a way have a degree of dispatch? Like he himself did not find imagining those things arousing. It was just that's what his job was. He was just sitting down and he was writing the story that he felt compelled to write. And it required him to imagine it, describe it, render it, and edit it. But he was able to do that with like as I said before, like dispassion. It's like, okay, well, I'm not sexually aroused by this, but I'm also not going to just give in to the taboo and not write the story that I want to write.
I think that's right, and it gets even more complicated because I haven't ever created a character as well realized as Humbert. And I'm not saying that to be overly humble. I think almost nobody has created characters as vivid as Humbert. And
I really like Hat.
But people should buy Tower by Jack Lees in case they were wondering.
I really like the hat, and I really like the briefcase.
These characters can start to exist in your head independently of you. So, of course, your personality and the personality of the characters you're creating, they're all instantiated in the same brain.
Yeah.
But I would consider they're separate entities. And they can behave independently of each other. And so you're talking about Vladimir Nabokov imagining sex acts with a child and not being aroused. And I think it's even more complicated because, let's say Vladimir Nabokov wasn't aroused by those things. But Humbert, the character, who is instantiated in the same brain as Vladimir Nabokov, was obviously highly aroused by these things. And Nabokov was writing through Humbert. So it gets even more complicated.
That's the level of sophistication that the virtual reality machine that is the human imagination can go to. And and a skilled storyteller like Nabokov can do that with finesse. And It's quite incredible, actually, isn't it? To think,
it's absolutely
somebody
wild.
pulled that off, and had the
he opened up the virtual machine in his brain, started running Humbit.
Yeah, and had the emotional discipline to keep on doing it, and also had the independence of his own mind, like Junger would say about not giving in to the culture in which you happen to be in and maintaining on the forest passage. Nabokov is just like, I don't care that this is a taboo subject. This is the story that I want to write.
I'm going to spend 5 years writing one of the most beautiful books in the English language about this extremely taboo topic, knowing full well how taboo it is.
What a fucking crazy book. Excuse my French.
Yeah, it is.
It's been a low swearing episode. I think that's my second F-bomb. So I'm unbelievably impressed by this book.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I think I feel like there was another question about the controversy stuff.
But the line between pornography and art.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah.
This is an interesting one because Nabokov,
great question.
in that essay at the end of the book on the book titled Lolita. Let me have a look at the exact name of this essay. Mm-hmm. But yeah, on a book entitled Lolita. I don't think he discusses pornography explicitly, but he talks about erotic novels. So like your Mills and Boons, etc. And what he says about them, I think you can generalize to also be talking about pornography in general. He says that what really distinguishes an erotic novel or something like a detective novel or some other piece of art that is stereotyped, as in it is written into a particular form. And when a reader, say if we're limiting this to literature, when a reader buys it, they expect it to be in a certain form and that expectation is fulfilled. Nabokov says that's different from literary fiction or purely aesthetic endeavours because those things don't narrowly focus on, say, the one or two facets of human experience. In the case of a pornographic novel or porn in general, it's focusing basically on that dopamine rush you get from seeing, from some depiction of the physical act of sex or the physical act of sexual gratification. And Nabokov regarded that as pornographic when you're just limiting things to that. Whereas he says Lolita is not an erotic novel because it's not narrowly focused on that. And it's true. It's the sexual dimension of this it's not insignificant, but it doesn't even seem like the main point of the novel. It's not the thing that's really focused on. What really seems to be focused on is Humbit's obsession and Humbit trying to convince you, the reader, that he is, if not totally right, then at least sympathetic. And that push and pull seemed to me much more important than the eroticism of it. And I think that's a reasonable point of distinction between pornography and art. Or if you say, if someone wants to define art as to encompass pornography, then I guess pornography and a deeper or more expansive forms of art, they don't narrowly focus on the physical gratification of sex.
And it would be clear to me that we should be able to make art about sex without it being pornography.
Yeah.
Because it's an integral part
as Nabokov did here.
Yeah. Because it's an integral part of, obviously, the human experience in life, and it's how the next generation is made. And okay, of course, that should be able to be depicted in literary form or artistic form, and even if it's a major or the focus of a piece of work, or it's a major theme in a piece of work, that doesn't to me meet the criteria. I mean, I guess I haven't explicated what's the criteria for pornography. It's one of those things where It's like when you see it, when you see it, you know it when you see it. You know it when you see it, yeah. And you could probably also say, you know, when there's a pornographer, there's at least one pornographer I know about. I can't remember the person's name though, where they make porn for women. I think there's like a whole like genre of porn where it's like it's more story driven and is about like couples going on dates and stuff and then having romantic hot sex, and tends to be more watched by women than just men who just want to see big dicks, big titties, and big this and big that, and just raw dogging it. There's a little bit more nuance to it. And whereas like this type of art that I'm talking about from this that's more oriented, it's artistic porn, but it's still porn. And so there's this gradation where it's like you've got maybe smutty fiction or smutty literature, and literature that has erotic elements in it, or that eroticism is a major component of the piece of work, but it is not its sole focus, which I'd say is like Lolita. And then you've got, smut fiction like at Mills and Boon. And then you've got artistic porn, which is like the chicks porn that I was just describing. And then you've just got porn.
Yeah.
And it's probably not a hard line in the sand between any one of them. There's a bit of a spectrum, right? And at a certain point, if there's no narrative drive and it's just a big body part that and big body part this just slamming into each other, it's definitely just porn.
I guess you can think about it. What's the telos of something?
Yeah,
and it's like if the telos of it is just something to masturbate to, then it's probably porn. Whereas, so like with Lolita, just assume then like Lolita is a conventionally very, very attractive 25-year-old. Even if that were the case, this is not really the sort of book that gets you horny, because
no,
again, it
wouldn't be.
Sex is not. It's dealt with, described very indirectly.
Yeah,
there aren't any sex scenes,
and that's not like it's not like what it's about. It's
no, that's
like
not really the point.
And it's about the relationship, and it's about the justification, self-justification.
Yeah,
Sorry, go on.
That's what I was.
Yeah,
saying.
It's not about
sex
I guess in a weird way.
I guess if something exists to be enjoyed with like a hand stuffed down your pants, then it's probably porn.
Yeah.
And if that's the intention, if it exists to get you physiologically excited in that way, whereas this book really isn't that. Like, even just putting all the pedophile stuff to the side.
Sometimes the telos of the as the list of over 500 different types of paraphilia will highlight. Some people just like shoes, or whatever it is. And I'm sure Nike doesn't mean to get off make porny shoes, except to some people. Maybe a nice pair of Air Jordans just does it for them, And to that person, those Air Jordans are porn. Contributes to Air Jordans.
I guess in the pornographic experience, the intention of the author should probably be considered.
Oh, so fucking weird, man. Human sexuality is just
it's kind of a black box.
It's funny, hey, like in every culture, it seems, if you look at like travel to different cultures and experience different cultures, or if you just read about, there's always so many taboos around sex, hey, and they're, even say, for example, like interracial couples, or in certain societies, it's, I don't know how common it is these days. I'm sure it still happens in certain parts of the world, but definitely in different parts of history. a man taking a 12-year-old bride was like the norm, you know, and they might read Lolita, somebody from a culture like that, and just be like,
what's the problem?
What's the problem? Why didn't he just marry her? Why did he have to do all this like dancing?
Yeah, the taboo is that he never married her.
Yeah, exactly. He should have married her first before, and like gotten her father's her mother's permission. And yeah, it's interesting because in a way, then the literary transgression of a sexual taboo is going to also be tightly coupled to the culture in which the author was writing, which is see like for example, I'm sure if you depicted depending on, maybe not, I don't know about these days in like the world, but probably at certain parts in history, if you depicted, say, like the Prophet Muhammad's sexual activity with like his wife, that you would get in trouble not for the depiction that that's what happened, but because you're depicting the Prophet Muhammad in this way. But not the underlying taboo is because of the depiction of Muhammad, not necessarily because of the depiction of a relationship with a like what we'd consider a minor in the West, in the 21st century. And that's, even just something like that is like where do these taboos come from? Why are they here? And then why does it make for such interesting and such hot button art as well? Why do these ideas, these memes, they've captured, because breaking a sexual taboo carries a huge kick in any society, it seems.
Like it really gets
red hot taboos. They're red hot taboos. And not in the fun way. I don't know what the answer is there. For some reason, just the mixture, like you add sex to something, and no matter what the society, there's almost no society. I can't think of any society or social context where sex doesn't have all this baggage on it that interferes with the way it's depicted in art. And then there's no kind of value-free sexual culture that every culture has. Maybe in the strict, like clinical, like medical setting where you've just got to talk about the biology of what's happening or something. But, outside of that sort of, like, we're talking about fixing, I don't know, like a venereal disease or something. Every other social setting that I can, or social cultural setting that I can think of, even with people who are quote unquote very sex positive, well, they'll have all these taboos around criticizing that sex positivity.
Yeah, but I think the fact that art can be effectively made about sex is because there are so many taboos around it, or because we care so much. So there are basically an infinite number of things in the world that have basically no baggage associated with them. Like, great art doesn't tend to be written about a tree bark or something like that. That's something that is just completely neutral to us.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I guess so. Yeah,
because they're
challenge.
I think
is that a
there
challenge,
needs to be a degree of
could somebody
emotional stimulus.
Write a short story about tree bark? See what you can do.
But there needs to be a degree of emotional stimulus to make you really care. And writing about sex, because people do, like, it's rare that you find a person who simply doesn't care about sex. We're in an interesting time now with there are an increasing number of people who don't have sex but watch a lot of porn. So there's still at least the visual component of sex is very, very arresting. So
yeah,
people really care about it. And so if you're making art and you want people to feel something, that's a way to draw them in. There's a lot of very cheap entertainment, say TV shows, which use depictions of violence to get you interested. That's another extremely high salience phenomenon for humans. If you want people to be interested in some TV show you've made, say, like having someone get their head chopped off, or spending a long time describing the intricacies of a very brutal murder is like, that's a common way to make people interested because it's emotionally resonant. It's high salience. So I think the very fact that there is baggage around certain things it in some way interferes with art in that it makes art be expressed in certain ways. But I think it's also a precondition to art being expressed at all because it needs to be just talking about something salient.
It's something that the art can be made in response to.
Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, interesting. So then can I okay, so then another question that comes to mind is then to what degree can art that is in response to taboos be like universal or more visionary or whatever? Like not just parochially responding to that artist's particular cultural milieu of sexual taboos. Is there, say, something transcendent about, say, even Lolita that even if or when or in different cultures? I think there must be, because I was reading on the Wikipedia page about Lolita. It has a whole bunch of criticisms, and there was this really interesting link to a story about a women's group in Tehran, in Iran, that was reading it. And the person, I believe it's banned in Iran, but it's like an underground women's reading group at the time. They read it, and it was talking about like how the women in that group found it an engaging and compelling and important book, maybe, but for very different reasons. Because to, say, a Western woman reading it in a place like the US or the UK, because they were saying this is something that they felt as though was very common in their particular cultural setting, but was not spoken about.
Yeah, that's, I think,
is very different.
If something addresses a situation that is high salience and common enough, then yeah, it probably is. It doesn't have to be parochial. Another example I can immediately think of is apparently Jane Austen's novels are very popular among Pakistani women because the world of probably like in part restricted freedoms for women and also a life that very much exists in relation to men is high salience to them. They find a lot in those novels
that's still relevant.
That is relevant.
Yeah, there's this deep underlying pattern of, in this case, there's like patriarchal social structures that are like, well, in the case of, sorry, did you say Jane Austen?
Yeah.
Which you transplant it into a different culture, like Pakistani culture, and it's just a different flavor of women experiencing patriarchy within their particular social context. But it's still this underlying pattern of patriarchal suppression of women. And in this case, like, Nabokov is depicting something that happened across time in cultures, and different women might have experienced a relationship like that themselves, or know another woman or another girl who has experienced that. And it doesn't matter if it was in Iran or in the 2010s, or whether it was in the United States in the 1970s. There's this underlying sense that, hey, this is, to the reader, not a good thing. Nabokov didn't care about that. He's just depicting the story.
Then also, so that's the content of a piece of art, if it can be non-parochial. But then there's also the aesthetic consideration. And while I don't think it can be totally divorced from the content, I think a piece of art can endure simply for being beautiful. And it's probably in some ways easier for purely visual forms of art. Like, say, we don't live in a society like that of Periclean Athens. And in fact, Periclean Athenian culture was very alien to us today. But for example, architecture from that period, we find intuitively very beautiful.
Yeah, or even like a lot of the Islamic art from
It's a different culture, but we find it beautiful.
Different culture over the last like few hundred years. I went to this Islamic art museum in KL. Amazing, incredible. This museum of Islamic art. Some of the most phenomenal art I've ever seen. Just incredible. And, comparable to something like art that I saw in like the Vatican or Museum of Modern Art in Sydney or whatever. Like, and I think I see what you're saying for sure. Yeah, interesting. So I think, what have we learned today here, Jack? This has been an interesting one. This is a challenging book.
It's a challenging book. It's like you said earlier, it's weird because at the same time it's one of the most mainstream books we've covered on this podcast, but also one of the most confronting.
Yeah. It's not quite as mainstream as the Bible, but it's definitely like 1%.
Yeah, I guess, so questions we often wrap up with, would we recommend this book? We've both said it, but yes, I highly recommend it. I think it's a wonderful book.
You're going to it with your eyes wide open. It's
very uncomfortable. Know what you're in for. He does not shy away from the pedophile aspect. That's front and center from the beginning. But
yeah, so if you're not comfortable with that depiction, then getting a look into the interiority of somebody who has a relationship with a 12-year-old girl, then don't read it. It's not for you. But if you're morbidly curious and want to see what we mean by being an extremely good writer, then yeah, it's a worthwhile read.
Yeah, but the prose in this book is astonishing. It's at the level of someone like Joyce or Faulkner at their best.
And it was his second language. Maybe even it was his third language.
Yeah. Did he solve his problem situation? So,
yeah.
Yeah. If his problem situation, because applying that to this book as opposed to a book of philosophy or something else, the sort of stuff we'd normally cover, a book which is more didactic, it's a bit harder in this case. But if his problem situation was to create something beautiful or aesthetically engaging and compelling, yes, absolutely, he solved that problem.
Yeah, for sure. And what's our any last questions? Should we? So let me just pull up my note.
Shout out to Ludwig, actually, who signed up to the Patreon. Another Swede. Just non-stop Swedish people.
Shout outs. Thanks to everybody for just being on Patreon. We are about to revamp about maybe by the time this episode comes out, actually some of our revamping of our Patreon and stuff will be up and running.
By the time it comes out on Patreon, probably not, because we release episodes early on Patreon. By the time it comes out for free, it could well be underway.
Yeah. So we'll be revamping some stuff, which is really cool because we've just taken into account that we're like patrons, let's jazz it up a little bit. Make it a little bit more worthwhile. So Jack and I are getting to work on it, getting our little tushes into gear so we can do something more interesting. But I mean, it's still, it's just part of the learning journey, hey Jack, of us figuring this stuff out. So maybe the other thing is content calendar. I think High Rise is the one that we've got scheduled after this.
Yeah, by J.G. Ballard.
That's exciting. You really like High Rise, don't you?
Yeah. I really, as most people who've been listening for a while will know, I really love J.G. Ballard, particularly mid-period atrocity exhibition, crash, High Rise era J.G. Ballard.
I'm pretty sure my partner really likes High Rise.
Yeah, well. she has read it.
Yeah. So that's cool. It sounds like a wild ride. Cool. Well, I don't have anything else to add except thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening. See you next time.